Arthur's Family Truth. The morning I drove my late wife's wristwatch to the repair shop, I told myself it was just something small I needed to do. I had no idea the man behind the counter had been waiting for me. Carol had worn that watch every single day for 31 years. A slim gold Seiko with a cracked crystal and a leather strap she'd replaced twice. Once in the late 90s, once the year before she died. She never considered replacing the watch itself. She said it kept perfect time and that was enough. I used to tell her a woman who worked that hard to keep everything running smoothly would naturally be partial to things that did the same. She'd smile at that and not say anything back, which was its own kind of answer. She passed away 8 months before that Tuesday morning, quietly, in her sleep. The doctor called it a cardiac event, sudden, unexpected. She was 62 years old, and she had been perfectly fine at dinner the night before. I had washed the dishes while she sat at the kitchen table with her tea, and I remember thinking there was nowhere I would rather be than in that kitchen with that woman on that ordinary night. I am 67 now. Retired after 40 years in municipal infrastructure management in Sudbury, Ontario. I have a house with a backyard that backs onto a small creek, a truck I don't drive much anymore, and a son named Kevin who called me every Sunday until he stopped. I want you to sit with that last part for a moment before I continue. The watch repair shop on Larch Street has been there since the late 80s. Gary Owens had run it since, before my son was born. He was a friend of our family for decades. Went to the same parish as Carol's parents. Fixed my father-in-law's pocket watch the year Carol and I got married. He is a small, careful man with thick glasses and hands that don't shake, even now in his 70s. I noticed the logbook the first time I ever sat in that shop 20 years ago. Same black cover, same position on the shelf behind the register, every repair dated and noted in Gary's handwriting, the entries tight and even nothing crossed out. I had always assumed it was something old watchmakers did out of habit or professional obligation. I never thought much more about it than that. When I walked in that Tuesday morning with Carol's Seiko in a small cloth bag, Gary looked at me the way people had been looking at me for 8 months, with that particular softness reserved for the recently widowed, and he said quietly, "Come in, Walter. Come in." He set the watch on his examination mat and turned on his magnifying lamp. I took the wooden chair across from him, the same one I'd sat in a dozen times over the years. We talked for a few minutes about nothing important, the weather, the road construction on Elm, the way people do when they are easing into something. Then Gary went quiet in a way that felt different from his usual working silence. He looked up at me, then back down at the watch, then up again. He said, "Walter, I need to ask you something, and I need you to not react until I finish." Something cold settled in my chest. He told me that Kevin had been in the shop 6 weeks earlier. Kevin had brought in a watch of his own, something with a broken crown, and while Gary worked on it, they had made conversation. Normal at first. Kevin asked how the shop was doing, mentioned that he'd been up to see me a few weeks before, said he was worried about how I was coping since Carol's death. And then Kevin had said something that Gary had not been able to stop thinking about since. Kevin had said he was concerned about my health, that I'd been forgetting things, that a doctor had mentioned the possibility of early cognitive decline, that he was looking into a power of attorney arrangement just to make sure my affairs were properly managed, that he wanted to ensure my estate was protected. Gary said he'd nodded along. It had sounded like a worried son. He hadn't thought to question it, but Kevin had said one more thing on his way out. He had paused at the door. Gary was specific about this, the pausing, the almost afterthought quality of it, and said that he'd recently spoken with a lawyer about updating my will. His words, my will, not his own, and that he just wanted to make sure everything still reflected my current wishes. Gary said the phrase had lodged in him like something he couldn't work loose. Updating my will, not Kevin's will. Mine. He reached under the counter and slid a folded piece of paper toward me across the mat. He had written down exactly what Kevin said, word for word. The same day. Because something in him had said to. Of course he had written it down. Gary Owens had been keeping records his entire working life. I read the paper 3 times standing at that counter. I drove home. I pulled into the driveway. I turned off the engine. And I sat there for 45 minutes before I went inside. The creek behind the house runs year-round, even in hard winters. I could hear it faintly through the truck's cooling metal, that low and steady sound. I have lived beside that creek for 22 years. I have never once found it anything other than ordinary. That afternoon, it sounded like the only thing in the world keeping time. I want to tell you about Kevin before I go further, because the weight of what I was sitting with in that driveway is not something you can fully understand without knowing who he had been, or who I had believed he was, which I have come to accept, are two different things. Kevin is my only child. He is 38 years old. He worked in commercial real estate in Toronto. He was not a difficult child. He played hockey until he was 16, kept reasonable grades, spent 2 years at Laurentian before transferring to Ryerson, finished with a degree in business administration. Carol cried at his convocation. I took photographs. We stood outside the hall in the afternoon sun, and I remember thinking that whatever I had done wrong in my life, I had managed to do this right. This one thing, this person, without making too much of a mess of it. I had not looked closely enough to know how wrong I was. When Kevin was 29, he married Sandra Bouchard, from Timmins originally, pharmaceutical sales. Carol adored her. They spoke on the phone every week, sometimes twice. When Kevin and Sandra moved to Toronto, I told myself it was just the ambition young people have, the pull of a bigger city, bigger opportunity. I supported it. Carol and I visited twice a year. Everything looked fine. What I did not know, and what Carol had apparently known and had been quietly trying to make sense of, was that Kevin and Sandra had been living in a way their income could not support. A condo in Liberty Village at a price point that made my eyes water when I eventually saw the mortgage documents, lease payments on 2 vehicles. A kitchen renovation Kevin had mentioned over Christmas dinner 1 year, as though $90,000 was an unremarkable thing to spend. Carol had said once or twice that she thought Kevin seemed stressed about money. When I asked him directly, he laughed it off. Business was cyclical, he said. Everything was fine. I had believed him because I had wanted to. That is the thing I keep coming back to, sitting in that driveway. Not that I was deceived, that I had made it easy to be deceived. There is a difference, and it matters, and I had spent 8 months not looking at it directly. I went inside. Carol kept a small roll-top desk in the corner of the spare bedroom. She was meticulous about paperwork. Bills, correspondence, insurance documents, everything filed in labeled folders and arranged in the order she had decided made sense, which was always slightly different from the order anyone else would have chosen and always exactly right. I had avoided that desk since the funeral. Opening it felt like crossing into something I had not yet earned the right to disturb. I found the folder almost immediately. It was sitting on top of everything else, not filed with the others but deliberately placed, on the flat surface of the desk where I would see it the moment I lifted the tambour. My name was on it, not Carol's name, not a label like insurance or house or 2023 taxes. Just my name, in her handwriting, in the blue pen she used for anything she considered important. Inside were 3 things. The first was a printed email chain between Carol and a lawyer named Linda Pace, dated 11 months before Carol died. The emails discussed Kevin specifically, his financial situation, and the questions he had been asking about our estate. In one email, Carol had written that Kevin had asked her directly whether the house was paid off and what she thought it was worth. She had written that it did not feel like casual curiosity. Linda Pace had recommended that Carol document her concerns formally and consider revising her will to include protective language around the estate. I read that paragraph twice. The second item was a handwritten note from Carol to me. I will not share everything she wrote. Some of it is private in a way I intend to keep private. But she wrote that she was frightened, that she had watched something change in Kevin over the past 2 years, that she had been trying to find the right way to tell me and that she kept not finding it, that she hoped she was wrong. She wrote that if I was reading this note, something had happened, and she was sorry she hadn't spoken to me directly, that she had been trying to protect me from something she wasn't yet certain was real. She had been trying to protect me, even then, even in a letter she hoped I would never need to read. The third item was a copy of a will, signed and witnessed, dated 9 months before her death. Carol had changed her will without telling me. She had removed Kevin as executor. She had named Linda Pace, the lawyer from the emails, as executor in his place. She had added specific language stating that if her death occurred under any unclear or disputed circumstances, a full review of her medical history and financial records was to be completed before any distribution of the estate could proceed. I set the will down on the desk. I looked at the dates. The email chain, 11 months before she died. The new will, 9 months before. The note to me, undated, placed on top of everything else, as though written last and set there like a hand left resting on a table. Kevin had stayed with us for 3 weeks the previous spring. The will had been changed 2 months after that visit. I sat on the floor of that spare bedroom for a long time, not because I had no next move, because I understood for the first time that Carol had already made it for me. I called Linda Pace. She is a quiet, precise woman, speaks the way people do when they have spent 30 years choosing words carefully and have learned that most situations do not require more than the right ones. She had been expecting my call. She told me that she had tried to reach me twice in the weeks following Carol's funeral. Kevin had answered my phone both times. He had told her I was not available. I had not known. He had never mentioned it. I want to be specific about what I felt when Linda told me this, because I think precision matters here. It was not rage. It was not grief. It was the particular sensation of a room tilting very slightly, not enough to fall, but enough to understand that what you had been standing on was not level and had not been level for some time. Linda told me that in the months before her death, Carol had described Kevin's behavior in terms she clearly had not used lightly. There had been an incident. Kevin had arrived at the house unexpectedly on a day I was away at a professional conference. He had spent 3 hours in my home office, going through files. When Carol found him and asked what he was doing, he said he was trying to help, trying to get things organized. He had smiled while he said it. Carol had not believed him. Linda also told me something that made the room tilt a second time. Carol had been experiencing symptoms in the months before she died. Fatigue, nausea, occasional heart palpitations. She had seen her GP twice. No clear cause was identified. Carol had not told me about the symptoms. Linda said this carefully, watching what she was saying because I had been managing some health concerns of my own that year, and Carol had not wanted to add to that. Linda said she was not making any accusation. She was not in a position to make any accusation, but she said that Carol had wanted certain protections in place. And she said, choosing each word the way someone handles something fragile, that she thought I should speak to someone. I knew what she meant. I had already been thinking the same thing for the past hour. What I did not say to Linda, what I sat with after I hung up the phone, alone in the spare bedroom with Carol's folder on the floor beside me, was that 3 different people had now handed me a piece of the same thing. Gary had written it down. Carol had filed it away. Linda had held it ready. None of them had known the others were doing it. The next morning I called Sergeant Barbara Crane at the Greater Sudbury Police Service. I brought 3 things with me: Gary's folded paper, Carol's folder, and Linda Pace's contact information. I sat across from Sergeant Crane in a small office that smelled like coffee and printer toner, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then she asked me 3 questions. Had Kevin had access to Carol's medications? Had there been any unusual purchases or financial behavior I was aware of in the period before Carol's death? Had Kevin been present in our home frequently in the months before she died? The answer to all 3 was yes. Kevin had stayed with us for 3 weeks the previous spring. I had already told her this, ostensibly because his Liberty Village condo was being remediated for mold. He had been present in the house every day. He had cooked dinner several evenings. He had been, by every measure I could see at the time, attentive in a way that I had found genuinely moving. During those same weeks, Carol had been recovering from wrist surgery and was managing several prescriptions simultaneously. Kevin had offered to take over the medication schedule. Organize it, he said. Make it easier for her. Carol had said no, said she preferred to manage it herself. I had thought nothing of it at the time. I thought nothing of it for almost a year after. Sergeant Crane told me she needed to do some preliminary work before I contacted Kevin or said anything to anyone. She asked me to behave normally. She asked me to reach out to Kevin in my usual way, the Sunday calls, so as not to signal anything had changed. She said it quietly, the way someone does when they are asking you to do something they know is going to cost you. I said I understood. I drove home. I waited. That Sunday, I called Kevin the same way I always had. He answered on the second ring. He asked how I was holding up. He asked about the weather in Sudbury. I asked about his work. He said things were slow but picking up. I asked whether he'd watched the Leafs game. He had. We talked about the Leafs for a while, in the way men talk about sports when they are filling space with something comfortable and without consequence. We were on the phone for 22 minutes. I asked about his work. I asked about the weather in Toronto. I asked whether he was eating properly, the way I always had, and he laughed in the way he always did. That short, easy laugh that I had heard my entire adult life and that I now could not locate inside myself a single clean feeling about. He sounded like my son. He sounded exactly like my son. And somewhere in the first few minutes of that call, I felt something happen inside me that I have thought about many times since. It was not hatred. It was not grief. It was not even anger. Exactly. It was something I can only describe as a narrowing. The way your vision changes when you're doing something that requires complete attention and cannot tolerate a single mistake. A coldness that was not emotional, more like a precision. Carol had prepared. She had done everything she could do. The least I could do was not waste what she had left me. I said goodbye when it felt natural to say goodbye. I hung up. I sat in the kitchen for a while with the phone on the table in front of me and listened to the creak. 3 weeks later, Sergeant Crane called and asked me to come in. The toxicology results from Carol's exhumation, which I had formally requested at Sergeant Crane's suggestion, with Linda Pace supporting the application in her capacity as executor, had come back. She told me sitting across the desk from me, with the door to her office closed. She told me plainly, the way I had come to understand she did everything. There were trace amounts of digoxin in Carol's tissue samples. Digoxin is a cardiac medication. It is used to treat certain heart conditions, arrhythmia, heart failure. Carol had no prescription for digoxin. She had no diagnosed cardiac condition that would warrant its use. In concentration, or in combination with certain other medications, it can induce cardiac arrest. In small repeated doses administered over an extended period, it is extremely difficult to detect without a pathologist specifically looking for it. The pathologist who reviewed the results told the investigation that the levels found in Carol's tissue were consistent with low-dose repeated administration over a period of weeks to months. Not a single event, something longer, something that would have looked at every step like ordinary tiredness, like ordinary nausea, like a woman whose heart was quietly, inexplicably struggling and whose GP could not find a clear reason why. I have a precise memory of the moment Sergeant Crane finished speaking. A phone was ringing somewhere down the hallway. The surface of the table had a grain to it, wood composite, not real wood, but the pattern ran in one direction, and I found myself following it with my eyes without meaning to. I thought about Kevin standing at Carol's casket at the funeral, his hand on the edge of it, and the way I had put my arm around him, and the way he had leaned into me, and how I had held him up. I had held him up. Sergeant Crane told me they were opening a formal homicide investigation. Then she told me something else. Kevin and Sandra had separated 8 months earlier, shortly after Carol's death. In the course of the separation proceedings, Sandra had retained a lawyer and had provided a statement. The statement described a series of conversations in which Kevin had spoken about my estate, about the house in Sudbury, about how once things were settled with his mother, the financial pressure would ease, about needing to be patient. Sandra had not gone to the police at the time. She had told herself she was misreading him, that the words meant something other than what they sounded like. People do that. People have reasons for doing that. But she had opened a memo application on her phone, and she had typed what he said. She had included the date. She had done this multiple times over multiple months. Carol had kept a folder. Sandra had kept notes on her phone. Gary Owens had kept his logbook and then a piece of folded paper. 3 different people had written down the same wrongness in 3 different places without knowing the others were doing it. And Kevin had been in our house for 3 weeks the previous spring, cooking dinner, offering to manage his mother's medications, going through his father's files, and presenting himself to everyone watching as a devoted son doing what devoted sons do. I sat with Sergeant Crane in that small office for a while after she finished. I did not have questions. Everything she had told me had already answered the questions I had not known how to ask. She said she would be in touch. I drove home. The creek was running. The house was quiet. Carol's watch was still on my dresser where I had left it, waiting to be repaired. Carol's watch part 4 of 4. Kevin was arrested on a Wednesday afternoon in April at his condo in Liberty Village. I was not there. Sergeant Crane called me afterward. She said he had not resisted. She said he had asked almost immediately to speak to a lawyer. She said he did not ask about me. I have returned to that detail more times than I can count. Not because it surprised me, because it didn't. The weeks that followed were procedural in the way that the worst periods of life sometimes are filled with specific tasks that give you somewhere to put your attention. I cooperated with the investigation fully. I gave statements. I provided access to financial records, to the house, to anything the Crown prosecutors needed. Linda Pace managed the estate side with a competence that made clear exactly why Carol had chosen her. Every system Carol had set in motion before she died continued moving. I did not have to push any of it. There was a bail hearing. Kevin's lawyer argued for release pending trial on conditions. I submitted a victim impact statement opposing bail. I have written very few formal documents in my life. 40 years in infrastructure management involved paperwork, but not that kind. I sat at Carol's desk, the roll-top desk in the spare bedroom, which I had opened once since finding the folder and had not closed again, and I wrote that statement over 2 evenings. I wrote about Carol, about 31 years of marriage, about a slim gold Seiko with a cracked crystal and a leather strap she'd replaced twice, about a spare bedroom desk I had avoided for 8 months because opening it felt like a trespass, about the folder she had left on top of everything, with my name on it, positioned so that I could not miss it when I finally came. I wrote about what it means to be protected by someone who is no longer there to protect you. Bail was denied. The trial took place the following January. It ran for 11 days. The Crown presented the toxicology evidence, the digoxin, the concentration levels, the pathologist's findings regarding low-dose repeated administration. They presented Sandra's testimony, Gary's written account, the email chain between Carol and Linda Pace, the financial records, which showed the full extent of Kevin's situation by the time Carol died, more than $400,000 across multiple lines of credit, a second mortgage on the Liberty Village condo that Sandra had not known about, and a private loan from a lender the Crown described as connected to organized financial fraud. The defense argued contamination, environmental exposure. They questioned whether tissue sample analysis conducted after an extended post-mortem interval could be considered reliable. They suggested Sandra's notes were the product of a separation proceeding and could not be read as neutral. They did what defenses do, which is find the spaces between certainties and stand in them. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the second afternoon, they returned. I was sitting in the front row of the gallery. Larry Nolan was beside me, my colleague of 20 years, the man who had driven me to court every single day of the trial, who had sat beside me every single day and said very little, which was exactly what I needed. When the verdict was read, I did not cry. I had done enough of that in the months prior. I sat very still, and I looked at the back of Kevin's head, at the way he was sitting, and I thought about the note Carol had written me. I hoped I was wrong. She had hoped. She had known. She had still hoped, even knowing. I have thought about that many times since. The combination of those two things existing in the same person at the same time, knowing and hoping. What it cost to hold both. The judge sentenced Kevin to life imprisonment, with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. That was 14 months ago. I still live in the house on the creek. The backyard is the same. The truck is the same. The creek runs the same in winter, as in summer, low and steady, and on quiet mornings I can hear it from the kitchen. Gary repaired Carol's watch. He replaced the crystal, cleaned the movement, fitted a new leather strap. He didn't charge me. I tried to pay him and he wouldn't take it. He put the watch in a small cloth bag, the same kind I had brought it in, and he handed it across the counter without saying much, and I understood that some things don't require words, and this was one of them. The watch sits on my dresser. Every morning I wind it. I don't wear it. It isn't mine to wear. But I keep it running because Carol kept it running for 31 years. And it seems to me that stopping it now would be a decision I don't have the right to make. There are a few things I have come to understand that I want to say plainly, without dressing them up. If someone is trying to tell you something they cannot say directly, listen to what they are doing instead of what they are saying. Carol could not tell me she was frightened of our son, but she went to a lawyer. She changed her will. She built a file and placed it where I would find it. She was speaking. I did not yet know the language. Document the things that feel wrong, even before you can name why. Carol did. Sandra did. Gary did. Not one of them was certain. All of them wrote it down. That is the reason a jury had something to deliberate. And if you love someone, a child, a partner, anyone, understand that love without clear sight is not the same as love. I accepted what Kevin told me because accepting it was easier than looking closely. Looking closely felt like a betrayal of the relationship. I have since understood that it was the opposite. The looking is the love. The willingness to see clearly is the thing that protects people. Carol understood that. She saw clearly and she still hoped. That, I think, is what it actually looks like. Carol's watch kept perfect time for 31 years. She chose it the year we got married. She wore it every day. She wound it every morning the same way I wend it now. The small, deliberate turning of the crown, the faint resistance, and then the give. Some things are worth keeping running. A note, this story is a fictional scenario, a situation constructed to reflect something that happens in real life more often than most of us expect. Over the years, I've noticed that the people we trust most completely are usually the ones we examine least carefully. Not because we can't, but because it feels like we shouldn't have to. There is a difference between trust and inattention. One of them protects the people we love. The other one doesn't. I wonder sometimes whether there's something in your own life that you've been choosing not to look at directly. Not because you can't see it, but because looking would ask something of you.